Well, it's been an interesting experience to have this book on the shelf. And I know, Jeff, you must have a good relationship with Nathan Brown, who's the editor
Indeed.
of Science Publishing.
Good man.
Right from the beginning, Nathan, as editor, felt that the book needed to be published. But if you look at the bookshelf of books by Science Publishing, it really doesn't fit. It's not either enough theology or it doesn't have the wrong theology, I don't know. But for whatever, and also the fact that it has pictures, and that's not typical in Science Publishing. The book is not autobiographical. It's not chapters. It's a book that is in the form of several essays. In fact, 8 essays. There were seven essays of the mind and from the heart. That was the subtitle. And the working title was different, but I finished the first chapter with a statement that, well, this may be a series of coincidences, or it may be something more. It may be a plan larger than I could draw. And so the editor seized it on that title, and that's what went. The book is mildly evangelical. It's not in your face, because most of us, and we include ourselves, have family or friends who, for one or another reason, move slightly away from the edge of the Adventist church, the Christian church perhaps. And it's good to be reminded that there is a God of love, and that God is interested in each person's life journey. So that's a simple premise. And the book has been well received by an atheist friend and a number of folk who go back to University of Sydney time. But it seems that that reminder is good for them, and it's good for us all. The first essay is on the Sydney Opera House. And that goes back to my years of study at University of Sydney for the Bachelor of Architecture. I moved down from the country to Sydney the very week that the Sydney Opera House competition results were announced. That was in February 1956. And during the 6 years of the program, I had many field visits. There was so much going on in terms of engineering, torsional steel, off-the-form concrete, which could only at that stage be produced by workers from Italy. Nothing like this was available in Australia. And so between official site visits and the fact that I was interested, so would go to the platform and see this change occurring at least every few weeks, I became very attached to this. That could have been the end of the story, but our final examinations were in the Great Hall of the University of Sydney, and that's a copy of Cambridge Hall in England. And I noticed as I was going into this final exam, which was professional practice, there was a little note pinned to the door, and it said, official guide and researcher, Sydney Opera House, and a telephone number. So I wrote down the telephone number and sat the exam and came out and then made the phone call, was interviewed and got the job. Researcher and official guide, Sydney Opera House. So suddenly the first few months of completing the architecture program put me in the company of Johan Utzon, the Danish architect. And that was important to the government because at that stage, the project had been in construction for 5 or 6 years. The stage one was complete, which was the substructure. And if you looked out at that project site at the time, it looked like a Greek theatre because you had the concrete risers but no superstructure. And so I was thrust into the situation of doing research, and I could handle this myself, comparing the backstage dimensions of La Scala Milan and the new opera house in Berlin and all the important opera houses around the world, and comparing the dimensions. Because there was a lot of thinking that this was going to be a white elephant. You know, Australians like the beach more than opera, and especially Sydney. Melbourne was the cultural centre of Australia. They actually had a painting school. Sydney was more inclined to go to the beach. So one of the first illustrations in the book is by George Molnar, and George Molnar has a picture of the sails of the opera house, and there's two people standing by, and one of them is saying, "Don't worry about the shell vaults, we'll never use the building," you know, so it was written off. Well, after this experience, it cemented the idea in my mind, which had been growing for 6 years, and that was to go and work in Scandinavia. And it was obvious which city we would go to, so Noreen and I set about that as soon as we had the opportunity to leave, we would go on a ship, and we did, which was in June 1963. Yes. And we arrived in Naples, and we took a train to Paris, and all this is sort of part of the story. The advantage that I see with essays is that one can diverge. And so I'm trying to suggest it's a slow read. You actually want to come with me. I want you to come with me. And as close as possible to be part of the journey. Well, we traveled in Europe for, 4 months, lived in a pup tent, and all this is documented in this first essay. And we came to the place where we needed to settle down. It was showing that there were signs of winter even in the parts of Europe where we were, which was more south, but we know we had to go north to Scandinavia. So we did, and we arrived into this destination city. For us it was Journey's End. Now, I had done research. In fact, there was a number of people, including Johan Utzon, the architect. But we had sounded out what it would be like to work in Scandinavia, and we found that it would be very difficult, number one, to get work as a foreign architect. And secondly, it was very difficult to get an accommodation, get an apartment. And the list went on. And then on the ship that we sailed from Sydney on, it happened that one of the passengers was the ambassador from Denmark to Australia who was going home. And so we heard via the grapevine that he was going to be on the ship, and we found him playing quoits. So that was another reason to substantiate our belief that yes, it would work out. We would get job in this work in this destination city. So we arrived there. I remember the camping the night before, where it must have been a surprise for the person that was looking after the deserted campground to find that there was actually someone camping there. But he took the money and seemed happy. So we parked outside the Architecture Riksförbundet, which is the architects' professional society. And I went in and spoke with the secretary. And the secretary was a real downer. I mean, she said, well, you know, it's impossible to get work. And it's very costly to register a vehicle. And you won't get an apartment. And she sort of had these list of things, which I'm sure she mentioned to a lot of foreign architects that were looking for work. But I went back to the car and reported to Noreen exactly what I had been told, which was all that we knew. We knew all of this. And it was just a momentary decision. We said, let's go to Stockholm. We had never thought about that. But within 20 minutes, we were in the car heading north. This was a Thursday. We drove through the night and we arrived in Stockholm on Friday morning. So I won't go into detail. The story is told in the book that all the reasons for being there were in front of us. We met people that we had never met before. We became involved in a number of things that were unexpected, including meeting a professor from Ohio State, and that led us to a master's in Ohio State. And before I knew it, I was on the lecture circuit at Harvard and also at Yale. And this was totally unexpected. So I finished that chapter with the suggestion, well, this could have been coincidences, but it could be something much more. So that was one reason to want you to come with me on the journey. I know from our Zoom Sabbath School how difficult it is when someone talks about God's leading and it's very personal to them and it's believable, but really there's a lot of questions because you don't know enough. And you say, well, that was their experience. In this case, there's two examples. I've mentioned one, but the two examples are where it is, in our mind, part of a plan larger than I could draw. The other case was 2.5 years later, the other side of the world, in fact in Mexico. And whereas the previous example, the message was, don't stop, keep going. And we followed that instruction. This one was, stop, slow down. We had no idea that we were to meet at sunset on a Friday on a gravel road in the mountains of southern Mexico. And we had all the frustrations you can imagine because that morning we had been at the site of Palenque, Mayan ruins. I'd done photographs and sketches and we were set out looking for a place to camp. And any signs or any directions we were seeking, anything at all that was going to support our travel further to find a place to camp for Sabbath was thwarted. And we finally got to a place where there were two roads. The old road was rough and it went up the steep incline, but there was a new road that seemed to skirt around the base of this mountain called El Tapón. And we decided that, wow, this is wonderful. We've got this new road. It finished within half a mile, and it was just against a pile of rocks, no place to pitch a tent. And we sat there for about 20 minutes, which was a ridiculous thing to do because we had better be on our way. And we finally did. We came back and we climbed this rugged road. The bottom of the Volkswagen was scratching on the rocks. And we came to this corner in the road, and there's a family stopped. And I noticed that there was Ohio plates on it. And we were so surprised we slowed down. I mean, we're only going a few miles an hour. And the question was asked, where are you going? And we said, Tuxtla. We knew the name of the town because we tried to find that road to Tuxtla all day. And so here's a piece of witnessing that we experienced. One of the tall Mexicans came across and he said, we're Seventh-day Adventists. We've stopped by the side of the road to open the Sabbath, and we're heading just a few miles down to an Adventist college. We couldn't believe it. Here we had this meeting on the roadside. We were meant to be there. And all the frustrations, all the conflicting directions and roadsides now made sense. And so we went there and we got there. It was so close to the opening of the Sabbath, which they were doing by the side of the road, but it was still Vespers in the church of Linda Vista Academy. And so our friend, Dr. Rodriguez, from working at Branson in Toronto, he said, that's my daughter speaking now, and there's my son in the choir. So anyway, I won't go on with that story, but it was just another one of these incredible, the two examples in the book that really, I think, encourage you to take the time, take the slow read, come with me and enjoy that experience. Well, there's reference to Andrews University because it played a very important part in my curriculum vitae. But I was reluctant to write about it. And it was the editor that said, you spent 10 years at Andrews University. You started the architecture program. You've got to write about it. And I said, well, maybe I can if I write about the students and about creativity. So I did. And that's one of the essays. Another one is called Africa, and that deals with our several excursions into Africa, including the project that we're currently working on in Western Kenya, a school for orphans. And that's a source of great joy for us, for sure. We have a Kenyan daughter, and that Kenyan daughter is now married, and the husband is doing a master's in teaching, and the daughter, our daughter Faith, is finishing her baccalaureate degree in music, and they have a daughter, 2 years old, and they asked permission of Noreen if they could call their daughter Noreen, which they did. So there's personal aspects of it, but that's essentially where the book sits. It's designed to encourage, to be mildly evangelical, but not to be in your face, and to have those that aren't quite sure about their own journey to not be afraid to read the book. So, any questions or thoughts? One of the things I've carried around is, this is 42 years old, because when I wrote about Andrews University, as I said, I wanted to focus on the students. And so at the end of the first year, one of our students in architecture, Donny Vasani, was very instrumental. What am I doing here? Was very instrumental in forming the student chapter of the American Institute of Architects. Now it's AIAS. But the idea was to make some money for their student chapter. So one thing they did was they hired a 35mm projector, and I suggested the film Dersu Uzala, and that whole account is in the book. And they made money, and so we were heading to New York, and there's another journey there. But Donny Vasani designed a T-shirt, the Ionic Man. And it's not quite the way we would say it these days, because I guess we didn't have many female graduates or students. We didn't have any graduates. But that was produced for sale in several sizes. And I've carried this around. It's never been worn. I was going to give it to the Architecture Resource Centre because I thought it might be something from the past, something that, goes back 42 years, 43 years. So you've had time to think about any questions.
Have you kept in contact with any of the students that were in the
Facebook is a wonderful way to do that. And you can understand that the first things you get from students as they graduate is, I'm applying for this graduate school, or I'm wanting to get employed by this well-named architect in Princeton or wherever. And one is absolutely delighted to write a letter of reference. But after a while, life moves on, and then it's just the buildings they're doing, the family that they're raising, where they're moving to. And so that's been a real joy. And Facebook is the reason we keep up Facebook, because of the contact with students. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about your time in Kenya? What you're
In
doing?
Kenya? Yes. It goes back to a publication called Dialogue. Dialogue is a general publication, and it's a quarterly in 3 languages that goes to libraries around the world, secular libraries as well as Adventist libraries. And General Conference has been very strong in supporting this. The editor at the time was, Umberto Rassi. He was the education director at General Conference. So he wanted to balance the number of scientific and theological articles with something to do with the arts. And so he decided in this first year, and that was in 1995. He asked if I could be interviewed, which I agreed to. And so they did a big splash of colour, watercolours, which was great. And then at the end of the interview, Umberto Rassi said, you might like to give your email address because someone might want to buy a watercolour. Well, that didn't happen, but 100 people sent emails. They were all consistent in wanting money, and it was all about education. So I was pressing the delete button and I deleted them all. 4 years later, I had another email, and it was from this young lady, aged 12 at the time. And she introduced herself by email as an orphan. Both parents had died, and she wanted education. She had not been in school for about 4 years. And I include some email correspondence in the book. So at first we had to be clear that this was actually a Kenyan girl seeking an education that we were going to communicate with, and not some smart guy on the edge of the Adventist community who knew enough about Pathfinders and the children's choir to be asking for money. And we were clear that this was a genuine case. So this is how it began. And we were going to Cairo a couple of years later. I was doing watercolour workshops on cruise ships, and we came to Cairo and did the trip on the Nile, and then decided to fly down to Nairobi and go across to Western Kenya, to Kisumu, and to meet this young lady whose name was Faith. So we did. And we went to the village of Rapogi, quite some way away. We were delighted to meet the family that had taken Faith in. They had 6 or 7 or maybe 8 of their own children, but had the same number of orphans that they'd brought in. So we got to know Faith and her carer, whose name was Lily. Well, then we had a meeting. This Lily organised 2 meetings. One was with Noreen and the ladies in the church, and they obviously talked about AIDS and health issues. I met with the guys in the shade of a number of trees. And as I began to speak to them, I became very conscious that they had something to tell me, which was they wanted a school. There were many orphans in the area, and they wanted to build a primary school. Well, that wasn't on our radar screen at all. We were there to meet Faith, and we were quite comfortable that by helping one young lady do well, this was what we were called to do. But they weren't convinced otherwise. In fact, they were convinced that at 3 o'clock on that date in that Sabbath afternoon in December, that we were there to help them build their school. And it was even more convincing than that, because this carer Lily had been to Nairobi and had registered a community-based program, which was to be the centre of the school development. So that's how it started. And 2013, we introduced the first stage, which was 3 classrooms and toilets, a well with principal's office. And then the next year we did a stage 2, and basically each year we've added another project. So one year it was the dormitory for 80 students, then a vocational school, because here we now were having students who'd completed grade 8. What do they do then, unless they've got some skill? The girls sewing, perhaps, the boys carpentry or agriculture. So that started to solve that problem. And that's where the community is now. It's doing very well. Not that there isn't issues such as famines and COVID and cholera and so on, but they're surviving well.
Just one follow-up question. How many students does it now cater to? How many students are involved?
380. Yeah. We have to stop it there because, as you can imagine, there's very few that can afford tuition. And there's that group, there's the next group that bring produce and have something in kind to donate to the food program. And then there are total orphans that have nowhere to stay. They've come from being sheltered by a brick wall, and that's about it, you know. So the number of orphans has decreased thanks to various things, including better health issues. But there's a part of this which is hard even for me to believe. And that is that there were 2 or 3 major landowners in the area of Rapogi. These landowners came across from Lake Victoria and they had fairly large tracts of land. And one of them had a son by the name of Amos. And when Amos came to finish high school, which was not usual for that particular community, he was asked by his father, "What would you like to do?" And he said, "I'd like to do architecture or engineering." So his father sent him off to the Polytechnic in Nairobi. He completed that course, and then his father said, "Well, I think you should do some graduate studies. Let's send you to Hebrew University in Jerusalem." I mean, this is amazing. And then he'd finished that, and his father said, "You know, you could get some experience. Why don't you go and work in Stockholm?" Which sort of was a parallel to what had happened to me. And so at the end of this, at the end of his education, he applied for the position of being essentially the clerk of works for all public buildings in Western Kenya. And that included the tribal area of Rapogi, which is the Lua tribe. And so you have this incredible situation that as the school is starting to develop and plan, there is this Amos who is only 10 minutes away in a window the next town. He is senior elder in the church there, and he's heading towards retirement, but he's very interested in the school. And so he's been the quantity surveyor, and he's been the person that, because of his British background in Nairobi, he understands the bill of quantities, the estimating. He does a priced bill, and typically that's almost exactly what the lowest tender is. There's 3 contractors in a sort of a catchment area. And the chance of that happening when, 2 foreigners come into a place and find out that the local community want to build a school, knowing that there could be all sorts of corruption and all sorts of other things going on. Here you've got this Amos, who's at that stage still driving to his office up in Sayre. So he was leaving on Sunday afternoon, coming back Friday afternoon, spending the Sabbath with his folk, his wife and children. And it's just been a wonderful asset, a blessing to have him as part of the program. Yeah. I wish you could have something like that in Eswatini. But I know you'll have other leading guidance there. It's wonderful.